Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
You know, being July, it's not just hot outside, but...
It's actually August, Marcus.
Wait, is it August? Man. Man. You got me.
Off to a good start.
Yeah. Well, being August, since it is August now, as you've astutely pointed out to me, I'm pretty impressed with how many people are still, like, all in turkey.
Yeah, I know. It's exciting.
Turkey mind. Like,
it's exciting.
You know, looking at our stats, I just kind of expected no one to listen. And you know, there's not as many excited people right now for turkeys, but I'm also really impressed by the number of folks. You know, they're not listening to us because it's us. They're listening to it because they love turkeys.
That's right.
So,
they just have to listen to us to get a little bit of good info about turkeys every now and then. Even a blind hog finds an acorn sometimes.
Yeah, an acorn.
Acorn.
I forgot. I went on a podcast. Somebody out there might remember it. I can't remember which one now. But we spent like 10 minutes talking about whether or not we were going to say acorn or acorn.
Well, do you say kern?
Yes, I say kern.
We're going to go out and put some kern?
Some acorns.
Put some kern on the ground?
No, because I don't actually ever do that.
Well, what do you call kern on the cob? You say it that way?
Yeah. Let me get some of that kern.
Some of that kern on the cob.
Man, that kern is good.
So what are we talking about today? Besides kern?
Well, kern might come up.
Very good possibility.
I wonder if I can get you back into your Alabama brain somewhere in this episode and get you to actually say kern in conversation.
It's totally possible.
Yeah. Well, I think we are about due for an episode because we're getting a lot of questions about this. I've seen some on yours. I get DMs about it. Folks are really interested to hear, what are they doing wrong? Like, what are the mistakes that people are making on their land?
Yeah, I know. And it surprises me that so many people are asking that question because, you know, you'd think the bulk of questions would be, what am I doing? You know, what do I need to do?
Yeah.
But I've been, you know, kind of surprised at the overwhelming number of people that want to know what not to do.
Yeah.
Being self-critical is often, you know, that can be difficult.
Oh, yeah. That's self-reflect a lot. It's difficult. Let me tell you what. It's difficult. When Lashley goes to self-reflecting, it gets a little difficult sometimes.
Is it because you have a difficult time finding things to critique yourself for, or there's a lot of them?
Well, I'll let you decide.
I need to ask Christine about that one.
Yeah, no, I can tell you that there's a laundry list of things to critique me on if you ask her. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just what can I do, also what do I need to stop doing?
Right.
And, you know, where are the mistakes at? So a lot of folks have really good intentions out there and they're doing, we'll put in quotes, everything they can for turkeys. and sometimes those efforts are going against their objectives.
Yeah. And sometimes I think, and we've talked about this several times, and I was a guest on another podcast over the weekend, and I mentioned it there as well, but I think it bears repeating that a lot of times I feel like the negative things that people do, they only do them because they don't know what else to do.
Yeah,
So if you give them other ideas, they take them and run with them.
yeah, I think that's a good point.
And one other thing that I did want to mention here, because it's come up to me several times through various means of communication with listeners and other biologists, landowners, is there's a lot of demand out there for like a calendar that gives ideas to the turkey manager, the turkey hunting landowner. I mean, really, even a leaseholder that has ideas of things that they can do at different times of the year to benefit
Yeah,
turkeys.
yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, maybe it even would be a way for us to help fund some of the stuff we're doing, or something. Maybe we can come up with something like that.
Yeah, I think we need to get off our butts and put together some kind of online store eventually with with
Well, I
like
mean,
a management calendar, and then we could, people have asked a lot about stickers and T-shirts and things like that. If that's
yeah,
something y'all are really interested in, let us know.
yeah, for sure. Like I said, we were fortunate that Turkeys for Tomorrow was willing to come in on this and help us get this going. But I mean, honestly, we're not content limited; we're funding limited.
Hmm.
We've got plenty of ideas on topics to research. Got plenty of ideas on topics to cover on the podcast, and we just need to be able to, pay for it. But so we're not in this to get rich. We'd be in a different business if we were. But you know, uh, maybe we can come up with some stuff that's not for profit that'll, give folks what they want out there, but also help us drive this engine.
Hmm. I like it. The only problem is that we're the two we're the two dunces behind it, and I don't know how to set up an online store, but we can figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure something out. But we definitely have some good ideas for uh, what's it called? Merch. What's the
Merch.
lingo these days? The
Yep.
merch.
Got
It
to get
used to
that
be bling,
merch,
right?
huh?
What didn't it used to be bling or something?
No, I thought that was like jewelry.
Well, I mean, a big old necklace with wild turkey signs written on it. You don't want one of those.
It's not quite my style, Marcus. It may be yours though.
Hey, you never can tell. Never can.
Get some rings to match it.
Yeah. I mean, right, I was thinking about some bumper stickers, you know, that have some of your quotes on there.
Do people really do bumper stickers anymore? I feel like we've moved away from bumper stickers into window stickers.
Well, maybe I guess I'm just kind of lumping those together. Sticky emblems that you put on your vehicle or bow case or shotgun case or whatever.
There you go. I like it. Yeah, some stickers, T-shirts, apparently calendars now. We
Yeah,
could pose for the calendar.
we won't. They'll be paying us not to send them one then.
I don't think we'd sell many of those.
No, no. Well, we definitely have some ideas on ways that we can, keep this thing going. But anyway, yeah. Well,
What
I guess
not to do.
yeah. Let's talk about some things not to do.
Can I start
Please do
putting corn out during the
it.
summertime?
Well, don't be bashful.
I figure we might as well lead with it. We've already teased it.
Yeah.
But yeah, putting corn out, really, I feel like any time of the year probably causes more harm than good.
Well, and it's interesting to me that you say specifically corn. Can you expand on why? Why are you specifically saying corn?
Well, there's lots of potential negative effects of placing a grain bait out on a property that's managed for turkeys. The reason that I mentioned corn in particular is number one, because it's the most popular grain that's put out to feed wildlife. And number two, it seems to be the one that's most conducive to growing aflatoxin.
Yeah. Well, the Mississippi work, and there's also some work in Oklahoma, although I have not seen the publication on that. I think that they are working on it. Talked to Coulter Chitwood and Dwayne Elmore recently about that. I think they have revived that data set, and they're working on getting it published. But
Now, are they sampling corn piles for aflatoxin?
yeah, they did corn and at least one other feed, which Dwayne talked about on our show
Mm-hmm.
with sorghum.
Yeah,
But they may have had other things. But some
right.
of the work was focused on aflatoxins, and I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. Based on the stuff from Mississippi and Oklahoma, I'm pretty worried about putting grain out just in
Yeah,
general,
right.
but especially corn. I mean, essentially, if it's warm and humid,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to grow aspergillus, which produces the aflatoxin.
That's right. Yeah, and aspergillus is a mold, and aflatoxin
Yeah,
is a toxin that it produces as a byproduct.
yeah.
And to add to that, like a little teaser, we are in the process of trying to test corn from our hunter harvested birds' crops for aflatoxin.
To see if they're
Right.
exposed.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of good work, and it sounds like there's some additional work being done in Oklahoma right now to look at the bait piles themselves,
Yeah.
and
Well,
and
that
and
I
how
think
much.
they're done with data collection. They're just working on publishing it.
Okay. But I hope that we're able to take that at least one small step further and look at the actual concentrations of aflatoxin that the birds have already consumed.
So
And
basically, a hunter kills a bird. It's got some corn in the
mhm,
gullet, and then you got that. I guess during your diet survey stuff, you've been collecting the corn kernels.
yeah, yeah, and it looks like this is preliminary. So it's only from a subset of 100 of our 900 over 900 birds that we've collected over the past 2 years. But if you just extrapolate the proportion of birds who had corn in their crops out to that entire sample, assuming that that relationship that we've seen so far holds true, we're looking at a little over 10% of the birds having corn in their crops when they were hunter
When they're
when
harvested,
they were
they
harvested.
have it in their crop already.
Yeah. And that is assuming that that sample of 100 birds is representative of the entire 900.
Well, it's 10%, so
Yeah,
10 of your 100.
right. That's right. And when you factor in that most of these birds are killed shortly after fly down, I think that that's a very conservative estimate of the
Yeah.
number of birds that are consuming corn on the landscape during
Well, and
turkey season.
also, presumably, people are not hunting near bait, or at
Yeah,
least they're not doing it legally.
right.
So,
Well, the
yeah,
bird that I don't know if I've even told you this, but the bird that you were there for, the one that I harvested this year on that hunt that we did together
yeah,
had corn in the crop.
really?
It did. Yeah, we killed that bird. What was it, like 10 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, it was late in the morning.
It was 9 or 10.
No, it was after 10 for
It
sure.
was after 10, and I texted the landowner that was with us, or the leaseholder that was with us, and told him that, and he said that he was shocked because we were right there. We were in the middle of
Mhm.
1,500 acres that him and one other guy hunts, and he said, "I know for a fact that there was no corn on that property." So
Where in the I don't even know where he would have got it.
I don't either.
So, it must have come from a long ways, and we were on the bird from, like, 7 till 10,
Yeah, and that's the other thing
and
that
it
I don't
and it
know is,
didn't move anywhere.
like, I don't know what the passage time is in the
Yeah.
crop. So, like, if a bird eats corn, an hour before they roost, is that going to still be in the crop the next day? I'm not sure.
Well, the crop is usually empty on birds that I mean, when you kill them right after fly down, like,
Right,
you might have 1 or 2 seeds in there, but
right.
they don't have anything in them.
Yeah. And that's what we see in most cases.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe if he just, fills up his crop with a huge, wad of corn, that some of that doesn't make it through that by the next morning, I'm not sure. There may be some papers out there on domestic turkeys.
With how long this stuff
Yeah,
stays in there.
yeah,
I'm sure there is. Another thing, we have a whole we've been getting tons of questions about this, so we have a whole series planned that we
hmm
want to really dig into the literature on a variety of things, including aflatoxins
right,
on it. Maybe we can also find some information like that, because I think
right.
that's important.
So
I wanted to ask you before I forget. Uh, have you determined that you can test those seeds? Like, is it going to retain the aflatoxin even though it's been eaten?
yeah, so it should. We do have some concerns about how the corn was handled once we removed it from the crop. It went through a freeze thaw process, which
Uh,
the aflatoxin is very stable in spite of freeze thaw cycles, according to the experts that we're talking to on grain testing. Um, but the one additional thing that we did is that we rinsed all of our crop contents with water. So because we're
yeah,
also doing a diet analysis.
mm-hmm,
So what we ended up having to do is we put some corn out on our demonstration forest and allowed it to age for about 10 days. And then we're basically trying to um,
mimic that.
mimic the process that we put the corn that was in the crops through it. We're trying to put it through that same process and then test that as control samples to see how it works. So we'll
Yeah,
have some of that corn that was placed out at our demonstration forest that we don't freeze, that we don't rinse, and we'll test it, and then we'll put another sample from that same batch through the
mm-hmm,
process that we put the crop contents through and see how the results differ before we move forward with testing the crop contents. Does that make sense?
yeah. So it sounds like at a minimum, if you can detect it, it will be conservative.
Yes. So it will be conservative, but from those data, what I hope to have is the number of birds that had corn in their crop, the proportion of that corn that had toxic levels of aflatoxin, and the amount of that they consumed, because we do have some information from those challenge studies and, in general, the literature to know how, what concentration and what quantity it takes to be toxic to birds.
Yeah,
And one thing that I do want to add to this conversation is the concern here, because a lot of people, when they think about aflatoxin, they think corn is all over the landscape now, right? Why are we not seeing mass mortality events of birds? And, um, I think what we have to think about instead is what are the sublethal effects that consumption of a toxin is potentially having on these birds?
yeah,
One of the things that is clear in the literature is that aflatoxin can compromise the immune system
mm-hmm,
of some species of birds. So, we're talking about, as part of the broader conversation, all these diseases that are either becoming more prevalent, widespread, or newly discovered. And then you challenge turkeys with those when they already have a compromised immune system, because they consume some tainted corn. And I think that is cause for concern. I'm not saying that
mm-hmm.
that's driving, declines in harvest that we're seeing in some states, but maybe it's a contributing factor.
Well, I think we have belabored this point, but I'm going to do it again anyway. We have lots of things that have changed on the landscape that we have some evidence one way or another to suggest that it's something we ought to be looking at. And this issue falls right into that.
Exactly.
One problem I have with it, with this conversation, and we've even already done it ourselves, the conversation is always limited to aflatoxin. Like,
Hmm.
that's the only concern.
Yeah.
And that was even one of the reasons I kind of poked you about why'd you say corn, because I've assumed it was because of that additional risk.
Yeah.
But
There's a
as we
whole.
will cover in detail, uh, you know, on multiple episodes on this, unless people tell us to quit talking about it. Actually, we're going to do it anyway.
Can we just do some of it right now?
Yeah. Well, that's just one issue, and
Right.
there is data to suggest that there are many other things that should also be of concern.
Yeah. For example, the vast majority of that corn that you put out is feeding turkey predators.
Yes. And that is, if you look at just game bird predators globally and look at feeding in different parts of the world, that is consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So we will go into detail in these studies and the percentages. I can't remember them right off the top of my head, and I didn't know we were going to get into it.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't want to really go off deep into it at the moment. But it's like 80% plus.
Yeah. It's usually in the neighborhood of 80% of the corn that you put out is being consumed by animals other than deer and turkeys.
Yeah. The other thing, so we're potentially subsidizing predators.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I want to get into in more detail at some point is, okay, well, why are we saying that we're subsidizing those and we're causing problems from a reproductive standpoint with the other one?
Yeah.
So one thing I'll just add, it seems to be fairly consistent that mammals deal with it better than birds. Is that?
I didn't know that. This is news to me.
Well, I don't want. I'm going to go into that in detail.
Okay.
I don't have the data in front of me to make that claim, but I have been kind of tinkering around.
Yeah.
In the literature on this issue, and I'm starting to get that impression. But do not hold me to that yet.
Yeah.
I want it to be a well thought through and well read dialogue when we have it.
Fair enough. To that point, though, there was another aspect of feeding corn that I hadn't really thought about before until this weekend. And Mike Chamberlain and I co-taught a landowner workshop, landowner management for turkeys in South Alabama over the weekend. And he brought up something that I hadn't really thought of that much before. And I think this is kind of part of what you were hinting at. But I think it's worth mentioning briefly is that turkeys are not, designed, if you will. It's not part of their normal life history traits for them to be consuming high carbohydrate content food during the breeding season.
Yeah.
During the fall and winter, they are more adapted to that. They eat lots of acorns, which have a very similar profile. But during the breeding season, they're supposed to be focused on higher protein content food items. And some of the landowners asked him when he brought that up. He said, "Well, they asked, well, why do they eat so much of it then if it's not correct for their diet at that time of the year?" And I mean, animals are really no different from us. Actually, I think there's a case to be made that they're out there scratching out an existence, pun intended, trying to live off the landscape. And if you were put in a similar situation where I can either, run around and try to eat bugs and berries versus I can walk down to the donut shop, you're going to make your living off of donuts,
Yeah, I already do. I mean, well, for folks
I wasn't going to call you out like that.
Thank you. For folks that are interested in all of this, there's a great book on it. I don't know if you've read it. I've read it multiple times, and it's definitely really influenced the way I think about this. It was written by Fred Provenza.
I've heard you mention it before, but the other weekend when we were together, you mentioned it, but I haven't.
Yeah. So it's called Nourishment. It's now on Audible, actually. So after we talked about it that weekend, I got it downloaded on Audible and listened to it on the way back.
Mm-hmm.
But there's that question to me is really intriguing. Why do they eat so much of it if it's not good for them?
Mm-hmm.
And then that also applies to humans.
Right.
I certainly eat plenty of things that are not so good for me to eat.
And case in point, we both have toddlers.
Yeah,
We were just talking about that this morning, that they want to eat a bunch of stuff that's not good for them.
exactly. So, but he really breaks it down, and I mean, this is the guy that's done the work on it for decades,
Mm-hmm.
literally, and it's really intriguing. We essentially, and I'm talking about just animals in general, are really programmed to exploit resources that are really helpful in short duration, that are rare, like highly digestible carbohydrates,
Yeah.
and also uh, it's pretty common for the way that we treat foods, the processing of foods, that we also the domestication of foods. Um, we strip them away, the plants. We strip away some of their secondary plant compounds
Mm-hmm.
that would basically cause an animal or us to become satiated.
Mm-hmm.
So, like what the cues that the animal would pick up on to tell them to eat less of it or stop
Like
eating
maybe
or whatever.
tannins, for example.
Yeah, it could be tannins or some sort of uh, other secondary compound. There's so many of them, like just phytochemicals. Which
Mm-hmm.
is that's the best word probably for it. But a lot of those things have been reduced through selection, so the plant is not well defended, and also doesn't give the cue to stop eating. And when it's paired with something like corn, that also is a readily digestible, you know, carbohydrate, we're programmed to exploit it, and we're not getting the cues to not do that. And he just flat out says in the book, using consumption as your metric of quality is a
Yeah.
terrible
Yeah.
metric, because the amount consumed is not necessarily reflective of selection.
Right. That's a super important point, and I think one that, if you're ready to, could lead us into an excellent segue.
Oh, you got a segue, huh?
And that's that, when you look at what turkeys are eating, you don't necessarily need to immediately assume that it's good for them, or it's the best thing that they could be eating.
Mm-hmm.
A case in point with that, and this is one that I know you and I have talked about before, and I think it was on maybe Fire University. I don't think it was on this podcast, but it's Bahia grass.
Mm-hmm.
And Bahia grass is,
Oh,
you
I
know,
think Craig did talk about that on his
yeah, he
list.
did mention it. He did,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's where.
It's prevalent across the southeast. It's planted a lot as an improved pasture grass erosion control measure. Turkeys will eat the seed heads. Older turkeys, not new poults, will readily strip the seed heads off of it. And in fact, at one point in time, it was even promoted as a turkey friendly plant.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think we have gotten off course, which I knew we would when we got on this topic. We've been going on for nearly half an hour, and we've only given people one common
Well, I
mistake.
was trying to lead us into, managing openings, and whether, what their plant composition is, that kind of thing.
Well, I'll go ahead and throw one out there since you threw out the corn, not literally. Uh, see what
I
I did
never
there?
throw out corn,
You didn't throw out
just
that
for the
corn.
record.
I mean, you're killing turkeys with it in the crop.
I always
We did
what,
not have any feed out.
the
I
real
can
reason
assure you
that
of that.
turkey came up that hill and crossed that creek is because I never leave home with without a little bit of pocket corn.
Just to jingle a little bit.
Remember on King of the Hill, pocket sand?
Oh,
Get a little
man.
pocket corn when they get hung up. You just throw a little bit of that pocket corn out.
Jeez. Don't give people ideas. Well, since you brought up the openings, I think one of the most common mistakes that I see, I mean, it's like every property I go on to help people on, the field management is usually poor.
Yeah,
And that comes in many forms. One, the obvious thing is it's a sod-forming grass. And, they commonly were like, well, we see them strutting in there and the hens with older poults. And so that is a common mistake that I see. Another mistake that I see that's on the same point is if your objectives are turkeys and you also like deer, I see people often plant things that might be fine for deer or may not even be the best thing for deer in some cases, but become problematic for turkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that we always deal with in the deep south, and it's always on the top of my mind, and I'm curious to see if this is what you were thinking, but ryegrass being in the mix is a problem.
Yeah.
And if it's ever been planted, you got it.
Yep.
Unless you have taken steps to get rid of it. And man, it's the structure and everything is so poor by the time you get around to when it matters a lot for productivity of turkeys, that causes some issues. But even, some things that are really good for deer, some of the things that mature much later, I'm thinking of some of the clovers in particular that are really stemmy and get tall and thick. It could be brassicas, it could be a number of things, but some of the plantings could actually detract from your turkey objectives because the fields structurally are not conducive to brooding in.
Yeah, pretty much anything that grows over 3 feet tall and is dense at ground
Yeah.
level.
So people ask all the time. I know that you get the same stuff. What should I plant? What should I plant? Well, that's one thing I see very commonly. People make mistakes there when their objectives are for turkeys. So I want to clarify that if you're planting it with the objective to extend forage availability for deer, that is a very different thing than trying to have a balance between a plot you can hunt on in the winter transitioning into a good brood plot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those
That's a
are
good
very
one.
different things. I think we covered some of those plantings really well, but that's one of the most common mistakes that I see,
Yeah.
where you could make a lot of ground real fast.
Yeah, hand in hand with that is mowing their food plots. That's something that I think people could be shooting themselves in the foot with.
Yeah.
Even especially like with clover food plots, I mean, Craig Harper has produced some really good data now that shows that you're actually not increasing the biomass
Mm-hmm.
of forage for deer by
Nor the
mowing
quality.
right, nor the quality. And that's been a long standing practice that almost everyone
Mow your
implements, and
clovers.
it's become dogma, at this
Mm-hmm.
point. Everybody
I
thinks you got to
literally,
mow your clover food plots.
I literally have a question right now asking me about mowing clovers
Hmm.
for weed control that I have not answered yet. I mean, it's just so common.
Yeah. Yeah. In general, the best thing that you could do in most cases, of course, there's going to be exceptions, but for the most part, just do your best to resist mowing food plots until after June or so.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get on into July, if it's too ugly, there's too many weeds popping up here and there. Those weeds are actually oftentimes, excellent, providing excellent cover and insect attraction for insects for poults. But if you just can't stand it anymore, just try your best to wait to July. One other thing that I'll note here, because a lot of guys that are managing for turkeys are also managing for deer, is that not only does mowing not improve your clover plot for deer from a nutritional perspective,
Yeah,
but
you don't gain production quality or weed control based on
right.
Craig's data.
But in addition to that, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but some of that data from that same study that Craig and his graduate students implemented showed that deer use of clover food plots was greater in the ones that were not mowed.
Mm,
So the
I
ones that
didn't
had,
remember that.
yeah, they had additional, weeds and structure coming up in them, and I think it increased the comfort and security
Mm-hmm.
level that deer felt using those plots.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I would love to see the insect production. I don't know if that exists, that data.
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't, we should generate it. Like, it's such a common practice.
Yeah.
And I know we've got several listeners out there, and they've already gotten this memo, and they've not been doing this, but it's still very common, and it's a prevalent thought in land management
Yeah.
that we need to get out and mow the clovers.
So
But I would love to see just from a bugging standpoint, what does the availability of insects look like?
yeah, it was funny because I already talked about that podcast that I was a guest on over the weekend.
What was it called?
It was Great Days Outdoors.
Great Days Outdoors.
I'm pretty sure
You
was the
and
name of
Mike
it.
Chamberlain were
Yeah, me and Mike were on it together. The host is Joe Baya,
okay.
Baya, and I'm hoping he's going to send me some info, send me a link when it's posted up, and I can share it on social media if y'all are interested in checking that out. But we kind of got to the same point in the conversation that you and I are at right now, and he wanted to do like a quick synopsis, and he said, "So you're already telling me that I can have improved turkey habitat by not mowing, or at least reducing the frequency with which I mow, and not putting out feed, especially during the summertime. And in addition to that, those are two money saving actions as well, or
Oh my
inactions, right?
gosh, the amount of
So you've
money going into feeders.
right, so you've already improved your turkey habitat and potentially, improved the vital rates on your property, and you haven't even done you've actually lessened the workload
Mm-hmm.
on yourself.
Well, it's something that working with Craig for a long time and being involved in land management, and now, working with a lot of people. People, you tell people, well, you do all these other things, and people immediately start thinking, well, I don't have time for that because they're adding that to what they're currently doing.
Right.
And just think about the amount of time that is going into some of these other activities and just changing that time investment. Like, what are you working
Hmm.
on the farm? You're
Right.
just you're not adding work necessarily unless you're not doing any,
Right.
which is the case with plenty of landowners. Um, but you're not adding work. You're just changing what you're doing while you work.
Hmm. A case in point for that is, when Craig came on and we recorded those 2 episodes with him, and he talked about implementing brooding cover quite a bit. That was our focus
Hmm.
on that second episode. And, he talked about how the necessity to periodically spot spray to maintain those areas in early succession that's conducive to brooding. And a lot of people look at that as too much work, but the reality
Hmm.
is oftentimes they were mowing that to begin with. So we're taking that out of the equation. And
Yeah.
now you're still getting on the tractor. You're probably spending a similar amount of time. It's just that you're using a sprayer wand
Hmm.
instead of a mower.
Yeah. Well, and I would argue a lot of these other things, especially when you see the responses of the plant community and the wildlife to those plants,
Hmm.
it's much more fun and rewarding to see that.
Yeah.
So, uh, I had another thing and now it slipped. I was trying to hold it through that conversation. uh, while we're on the fields, I think we have touched on this in various forms, and we did even in the Q&A. But another problem that I think is consistent is there's not organization, I guess, in terms of what you're doing where.
Hmm.
So, considering the biology of the species you're targeting, and not just in which vegetation types and structure and everything do they need, but how do they need them to be arranged, and how can you maximize that by arranging them
Hmm.
well across your property. I
Yeah.
think that's something I see, and one of the things I probably focus the most on when I work with landowners is trying to organize those things such that you're maximizing the benefits of those practices.
Mm-hmm.
So making sure that brooding cover is accessible in many areas, making sure that it's adjacent to nesting cover, making sure that they have access to roosting locations, setting it up for hunting.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I've grown to really appreciate, is how much you can consider huntability in that equation and really make a high productivity population that's also huntable.
Right.
I think there's a lot of fun in that.
I mean, that's the end goal, right?
Right. I mean, why are you doing it
making
anyway?
more turkeys is the means to an end of taking
Yeah.
more turkeys.
We probably have 2 or 3 listeners out of our 4. No, it's more than that. We'll say 14. We probably have a few that just want to make more turkeys just because they like making more turkeys. But most of them, I think the end goal is to hear one goblin coming into the barrel.
Make them so you take them.
Make them. Yeah, you got to make them. So I definitely think, spending some time and maybe your property, you're managing it with other lease mates or family or whatever, friends. Sit down and think through how can you strategically organize
Mm-hmm.
things such that they're not only accessible and usable for the reasons that you're creating them, but also they're creating opportunity for you to hunt.
Yeah.
There's no reason you can't add that right on into that mix.
Yeah. That really good point. And to give somebody a concrete example of that, if a landowner is looking for places to create brooding cover, because repeatedly we've established that as one of the most limiting factors, what's the maximum distance that you would want any turkey to have to go on your property to access brooding cover?
What's the maximum distance I would want it?
Yeah.
Are you asking? In other
Yes.
words, so the maximum distance you would want to brood right after they hatch.
Yeah. So like if you plopped a nest anywhere on your property,
Yeah.
what's the
Well, I just want
greatest
to.
distance you would have those birds need to travel to
Yeah.
access brooding?
So I just want to make sure that the audience is clear on what we're talking about in brooding,
Okay.
because a 3-week-old
Sure.
brood is very different. So, right, think about the size of an egg. Right, when that egg hatches, that little thing is tiny.
Mm-hmm.
It can't go far. The hen stays around the nest for a couple of days, couple of 3 days, and then she moves them to where she's going to brood. For me, I want that. I mean, at a minimum, to be under 200 yards.
Yeah.
And I know Mike Chamberlain has presented some data showing at what point do we get to where there's no survival. Do you remember that
I
number?
think it's 400 yards.
Okay.
If she had
Well,
to move them beyond.
I don't even want to get close to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, that's worst case scenario. You don't want her to take them so far that none ever survive.
Right.
Like, we want to stay way below that.
Right.
So I don't know what the exact number is, but I am consistently thinking I want to provide a really good situation for birds to nest in
Mm-hmm.
and have something directly accessible within even, tens of yards.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff in South Florida, we've got one of the properties that we work on. I've recorded actually some footage, and we're going to put together a video similar to the one with Craig Harper from Tennessee that we have on YouTube. We're going to have a similar video from the Osceola range, but man, I just loved it. We were creating it. Well, the land managers there, I'm not actually doing it. They are. I'm just studying turkeys in it. But we had a bunch of nests that were in this little clump of vegetation. It was like a little hardwood inclusion in a burned area, and basically the turkey could get into a forb-dominated, recently burned area within like 20 or 30 yards.
Wow.
So it was just the organization was so good, and that was just spread out all over the property, and much of it was being created because of moisture and fire interactions in that landscape. But you can learn from that, and you can deliberately cause that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Whether you're deliberately changing the way that fire spreads, or where you put fire, or how you're managing vegetation directly adjacent to each other. But I'm trying to think about it in that context where I don't want the hen to have to go 100 yards to get into good breeding cover.
Yeah.
Like I think that, we're starting to get really risky if we're forcing her to do that.
Yeah. And I think, and practically, if you're a landowner that's starting with essentially zero brooding cover, I think I would establish an initial goal to, let's get it to where if I drop a pin in any of our likely nesting cover stands. So, we got plenty of episodes on that. Dr. Harper created an awesome YouTube video showing what nesting cover looks like. If you're not sure, go back and listen to those, or go
and that
watch that
video,
video.
it's basically every context.
Yeah. So go back and watch that video, find out what nesting cover looks like, and then drop pins in all the places on your property that do provide some nesting cover. And initially, maybe you try to get that number down to less than 400 yards. That's our starting point. But I think you need to be establishing
where there's brooding cover.
Where there's brooding cover within 400 yards of all those nesting locations. But then over time, I would like to see incorporated into that landowner's plan a means of increasing the number of brooding patches throughout the property, so that they could slowly work that number down over time to 300, 200, and maybe even like 100 yards.
Yeah. So I think that's a great way to do it. I love the visualization as well. We've got all kinds of apps and softwares and everything that are freely available to people that you can do this kind of stuff. Just to visualize where is the nesting cover, and where do I need to have brooding cover?
Yeah.
Another thing, to think about in that, and I think we have talked about it in various ways. When we're talking about the distance of nesting and brooding cover, how far that is apart, we're essentially talking about space in the middle that we would not want them using for one of those reasons. And that doesn't mean they won't, but it's not what you want them to be using.
Right.
Creating, like when we've talked about daylighting roads, that's great way to do this. But when you create corridors of vegetation that can be traversed safely, you're basically reducing the effective distance between things. And, think about it like, if you're an electrician, you could think about resistance or however you need to think about that. But you're basically trying to make the landscape as easy to move through and safe as you can. And it may not be that you can put nesting and brooding dedicated space right together, but you might be able to reduce the effective distance between them by connecting them better.
Yeah, so making sure, for example, that they're not walking through just a wide open understory.
Yeah, or a Bahia grass field.
Or a Bahia grass, yeah. I mean, I think that those are the opposite ends of the spectrum of things, areas that we would not want broods to have to travel through.
Exactly.
Whether they be too thick for them to move or too open for them to survive because they get picked off. And I think that brings up another really good point. This directly related to the topic of today's episode is that I think, and I see lots of examples of landowners that do not take advantage of timber harvest to improve their habitat quality. So we know intuitively that if we're getting sunlight back to the ground through thinning, that's oftentimes going to benefit ground dwelling species like turkeys. But what they're not doing is they're not taking that timber harvest as an opportunity to recognize that hey, maybe I'm going to put in a little patch clear cut over here because I don't have brooding cover in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Or this.
Or take it as an opportunity to widen your roads.
Widen your roads, create wide shoulders that you can manage in brooding cover. Or maybe I realize that roosting cover is limited on my property. So maybe I'm not going to cut all those last few pine trees or whatever species they are right up to the riparian area, right up to the stream side. I'm going to expand that SMZ out. There's lots of opportunities where you can get really creative with timber harvest and recognize too that, on a given property, you may only implement one timber harvest in 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
So that is a significant opportunity to quickly improve habitat quality on your land.
Yeah. And they cut where you tell them to, like which ones you want. They don't cut if you tell them not to.
Right.
Like you have control over what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, it has to be financially valid,
right,
for them to come and do it. But you have flexibility. You don't just have to do what they want to do.
Yeah, and even when you replant, right? There's decisions that can be made if you're replanting that stand that can benefit turkeys. If you're on the right soil, maybe you move from loblolly pine to longleaf pine or slash pine or something like that. That's going to have less of a stem exclusion phase, less of a closed canopy phase where you can't get fire in there and things like that. Or maybe when you replant, you specifically don't replant certain lanes throughout the stand that would potentially increase the connectivity of the property.
Yeah. Along those same lines, when you're replanting, take that opportunity, and for some reason there's a barrier here, which I want to expand on. Don't plant take that opportunity to use where you plant to widen the road, right? Like that's your chance to do that.
Yeah.
And I see it as a barrier, especially for folks that have timber production as one of their top few objectives.
Yeah.
And if it's your top objective, then that's fine. But if you're one of those people that's saying it's turkeys, I see it really commonly, hear it from people, and I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it, not being willing to give up one or two rows.
Mm-hmm.
The productivity over 30-year rotation or whatever, depending on what species you're planting and where, I guess, but like you're not giving up that much value in timber over a long-term period to potentially increase productivity substantially.
Yeah. But I mean, even if it's several $1,000s that you're leaving on the table by not planting those areas, that's several $1,000s, over 25, 30 years.
Yeah. And then the thing that's kind of baffling to me about it is then you compare how much, like the lost, let's call it lost opportunity cost right there.
Mm-hmm.
The lost opportunity cost is a barrier from doing it, and then you spend 2, 3, 5, 6, 10 times as much. I mean, hell, 10 times as much per year on practices that are making you go backwards.
Right. Yeah. And that's something too that, if you're uncertain about it, you could talk to your forester and find out from them, because they know your local timber market. They know the product that you're growing, and ask them, if I don't plant 2 rows along this roadside on the edge of this loblolly pine stand, what dollar amount would you project that I'm giving up over the life of this stand?
Yeah. Well, I mean, calculate the length. I mean, you could calculate the area.
Yeah.
That you're going to not have in trees and estimate, just kind of do a backdoor estimate of how much are you producing per acre.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a common barrier and a mistake as a result of that barrier. Another thing that goes right in with this conversation is I see this mistake. People do not want to kill a tree or do not want to cut specific kinds of trees, particularly oak.
That's a good one.
And I understand why that's a valuable tree. You see it limit not just with killing trees or cutting trees, but also with burning.
Yeah.
Another
I think in
big
general,
barrier.
just not managing hardwoods.
Yeah. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
This would fall under the banner of.
Yeah. I think sometimes that's a mistake.
I would agree.
There are plenty of. It's fine for you to have some places that you set aside and even desirable, but I think in many cases it limits people, and they're making a mistake in terms of their objectives by letting that be a barrier.
Especially if you're on a property that doesn't have much pine to manage. And I
Yeah.
mean, even in the South, in the Mid-South, you get up into places in like South Central Tennessee and
Yeah.
you may not have that
The
much pine.
Appalachians and Central Hardwoods. I mean,
Yeah.
there are a lot of people that have mostly hardwood.
Right. And, I went over this at that landowner workshop last weekend too. And because I was talking about actively managing hardwoods, and, I was talking about Mark Turner's study that he did with me here at Auburn a few years ago. And he increased sunlight in mature closed canopy hardwood stands by about 30 to 40%. He was using herbicide to kill undesirable species to accomplish that objective. And, for the most part, the trees that he was injecting with herbicide were, low value to turkeys, sweet gums, maples, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But occasionally we did kill some oaks.
Mm-hmm.
In stands that had a good species composition of oaks, that had already a fairly high basal area of various oak species. Occasionally we would, find, let's say, a red oak that had overtopped another red oak that was only a few feet away from it. We might kill the one that's overtopped. And yes, there's a lower basal area, lower total abundance of oaks in the stand now, but the one that you left behind has more resources freed up that it can put into its canopy growth, which is linearly, or not linearly, but is correlated positively with its acorn production. So yes, you took out a tree, but you also brought some sunlight back to the ground by removing that tree, which can provide some nesting or brooding cover. And concurrent with that, you allowed the remaining oak tree that you left behind to produce more acorns during fall.
Mm. Well, I did a lot of work with Craig during my master's on oak management and very similar stuff to some of what you did with Mark. But also, I did a lot of acorn counting.
Yeah.
Still am, actually. I
Yeah.
have a grad student currently, and she has been tracking 800 and something individual oaks of various species, and we're looking at a bunch of acorn stuff. But one thing that's kind of just stuck in my head over a long term was that been 15 years ago now, is about half of the oaks are producing about 85% of the mast.
Yeah.
And there are about a quarter or more, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was around a third, between a quarter and a third, are producing none.
Yeah. I thought the number that I remembered, and maybe this is species specific to white oaks.
That's what our study in Tennessee was.
I thought it was a third of the white oaks were producing 3/4 of the acorns.
That very well may be.
I've got a slide in my habitat class that says that, so I hope it's right.
No, I mean, you could break it down in different ways, and it probably is close to that.
Yeah.
The number that I have in my habitat class is 50% of the oaks produce 85% of the mast.
Okay.
And then the other grad student at the time and I were trying to look at some canopy expansion type stuff. We were in a forestry class at the time. And we thought even just by canopy expansion rate, we would only, if you cut down half of the oaks, the reason I did it as half is because with a typical shelter wood harvest that I was looking at in my graduate studies, we were cutting about half of the trees. So we wanted 50% sunlight, give or take. So that's why I did half. But I was like, if you knew which ones are those in that 50% of good, and you let those be the 50% that you leave, you could actually increase mass production in about 2 years by cutting down half of the oak trees.
Right. And there's some ways that you can monitor. I mean, it adds,
Mhm.
a certain level of complication and time to the whole endeavor.
Sure.
But you theoretically could go out for, 3, 4, 5 years consecutively
Yeah.
and have an established survey route and look up in the trees, during the fall
Mhm.
and see which ones have acorns and which ones don't. You can mark those trees and keep tabs in a notebook of which ones are producing
Mhm.
and which ones aren't. And you can remove the ones that aren't even producing.
Yeah. We had about, I wanna say it was 60 acres or so of a timber sale on my family's land, and I grew up hunting on that land. I knew every tree on it.
Mm,
I mean, seriously.
hmm
I knew this white oak produces consistently, and
Yeah.
I kill deer on it, and this other one, I don't ever see any acorns.
Yeah.
And, I actually went down with Coulter Chitwood and then, Brandon Sherrill, another graduate student, one of our friends. We all 3 went down together before that timber harvest, and we walked through, and I told them, we were just walking. They didn't know any of the trees, but I knew every one. And I was just hollering, "Yeah, mark that one, mark this one," and I'm marking them. And we marked the whole thing, and we retained about 15% of the trees.
Yeah.
And it was just the excellent producers, and it's for a while, it was an oak savanna. I don't get to go home as much, as I would like, and we've got some terrain issues with keeping that particular area burned.
hmm
But, man, it produced such a beautiful
I bet.
thing, and
And
the trees were, like, clumped too, like, you'd
yeah.
have 2 or 3 trees that happen to be good producers, and then you might have you know, a 10-acre swath that doesn't have any trees in it.
Right.
So, the variability and structure, it was basically variable retention, but
Right.
pretty extreme version of it, and, uh, I've told people several times, I think I've said it on the air before, I mean, you roll down the hill under those trees because they just produce tons of acorns. All the good ones have
Yeah.
it's all the resources they need and the canopy expansion. It's just been a really great practice that we put in, and I didn't even have to go and track the oaks. I just had been doing it because
Right.
I'm,
Right.
an avid hunter and had been tracking them my
Right.
whole life.
And I know we're mostly turkey hunters here, but we also need something to do in the fall. So I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there that have sat in a deer stand during the fall, and you set up a new spot, especially if it's a new property, and you find this like beautiful grove of white oaks, or maybe even one or two really large white oaks that were boundary trees or something like that that were left behind, and there's not many others around. And you set up on that spot, and you think it's just going to draw, every deer on the property like a magnet, and
Mhm.
it's just unproductive year after year after year, and that's kind of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess my point of, that dialogue is killing oaks does not mean that you're reducing mass production.
Yeah,
It might mean exactly the opposite if you do it in a clever way.
yeah, and there's even to add to that, there are even some species of oaks for which acorn production starts to decline after
Mhm.
they reach a certain size.
Yep.
White oaks being one of those. Now they have to
Mhm.
get really big. I think white oak is like they increase production until they get about 30 inches dBH, I believe is the number, and then they start to tail off.
Mhm.
But there's some other tree species, oak species in particular, that fall into that mold. Some of them start dropping off even sooner than that size class. But just another thing to consider as far as or to weigh into the equation when you're considering whether or not to cut or kill an oak tree.
Mhm. Yeah.
What else you got? I mean, we've covered a pretty good bit of ground today.
Yeah. How many we've given, like, 3 mistakes or 4? Corn, mowing, arrangement.
Why do you got to go back and count them like that? I feel like
Well, we've been talking
you're
about it now.
undermining the value that this episode brought.
No, I think, this is stuff that we need to discuss, and we need to expand on some of these, like, the feeding issue. Again, we talked mostly about aflatoxins, but the predator subsidization, we've got data from
Yeah,
other areas suggesting that's a problem. We have data showing pathogen loading around feeders, especially some pathogens that could be of consequence to turkeys. There is data out there that we need to unpack and go through in detail.
Yeah.
On that issue, I think we have been really hammering habitat for a while, which I think is needed, and our audience seems to appreciate it. So
maybe that's self-selecting. It's only the ones that are interested in that topic or the ones that are listening still.
Yeah, maybe so. But another thing, if there's a topic that folks think that we need to spend a lot of time on and have a few episodes and maybe target some experts on it, we're all ears. I know we've got a running list of ideas that are, some of them are coming in from listeners, some of them are things that we hashed out. We do plan to do a series on the feeding issue and disease.
We've got to get to that one soon because I feel like we've been teasing it for a while.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that we want to really be polished on the literature.
That's when we don't want to shoot from the hip on.
Right. And I've been collecting the literature, so I have a lot of stuff. I just need to really sit down and organize it and collect my thoughts on it. So maybe that'll be the next big series, I think, that we do.
And I think, recording and launching that pretty soon would, this is the prime time of year to do that, because a lot of, there's a lot of bucks that are starting to finish up their antler growth, and people want those velvet picks. They want to start scouting their deer and, planning out their deer season, putting together their hit list and all that kind of thing. So
yeah,
it's prime time of the year to put that information out there for people to weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah, and not only that, it's also a time of the year where corn's probably not a good option.
Yeah,
at least for the South. So
September and bow season in many states is just around the corner.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing, just kind of circling back for 1 second with the nutrition argument, I like that, but what about poults? Like we're wanting them to eat almost exclusively insects,
right?
I'm getting plenty of those pictures. I'm seeing them online of people with a big brood with a hen standing under a feeder.
Yeah, when they're several weeks old.
Mm-hmm. Probably not the best thing for those. But to be clear, I don't know. I don't know that we have direct data on that particular aspect.
No, I'm not sure either.
But it doesn't seem like a good idea.
All right.
Any other burning issues?
Yeah, I guess the one thing that we didn't talk about, but y'all tell us if I realized as we were going through this today that we have not talked much at all about managing hardwoods. And if that is something that listeners are interested in, we could do a whole breakout episode on that. Marcus and I have done quite a bit of research on managing hardwoods for deer and turkeys. So we're happy to expand further on what we've already discussed and even go more so into implementation, how the landowner can accomplish that. And, what are some trade-offs associated with doing it? Let us know. But I say all that to get back to, a lot of folks also aren't burning hardwoods. We talked about, killing or cutting some hardwoods to achieve various objectives, but there's a lot of hesitancy to burn them as well. And we could get, like I said, more in detail on that in another episode.
Yeah. Well, I definitely have gotten several questions and comments on a related note. Like, what if we're all bottoming hardwood? We haven't talked about that much. We need to do an episode on that.
Yeah. Well, cool.
So
still got plenty of ideas to keep it running.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think we did a pretty good job covering several of the major issues. There are probably plenty of other ones. I'm sure folks are going to reach out to us. I already saw that we've gotten several messages that were tagged on together since we've been on this one about the this recent episode we had.
Oh, I'm sure.
Curious to see, what those folks have to say. But I want to reiterate, we couldn't do this without the support of the audience, and you guys have been great. love all the feedback, the questions. Keep it coming. You're giving us ideas. Hopefully you see that because you see things that you're bringing up to us coming up on the air. So we really appreciate all that feedback, everybody rating the podcast, all those things. It's just been really awesome. Glad to see there's still a whole bunch of people out there thinking about turkeys right now, even though we're at the end of July.
Yes. Thank y'all so much.
Yep. Appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.